You will walk away with absolutely nothing. That is what my wealthy husband told me. He tossed his Porsche keys onto the marble counter with a cold, arrogant smirk. He was absolutely confident that his 24-year-old mistress was waiting for him. He firmly believed I was just a naive, broke military wife. He thought he held all the cards. He thought he was leaving me entirely bankrupt. He had no idea that for 20 years, I had been quietly building a massive financial empire in the shadows. He did not know that when we stepped into that freezing courtroom, the judge was not going to hand him a victory. She was going to hand him his absolute destruction. This is a story about the devastating cost of male arrogance and the unstoppable power of a woman who fiercely protects her own independence. If you believe that a woman's quiet strength should never be underestimated, please leave a like on this video. Type "I am powerful" in the comments below. Share this story with a sister who needs to hear it. And make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a journey of ultimate justice. You will walk away with absolutely nothing. Sarah. That is what my husband of 20 years told me. The words did not come out as a shout, nor were they delivered with the heated passion of a sudden, desperate argument. Instead, they were spoken with a terrifying, absolute calm. Richard stood in the center of our custom-built kitchen, a space he loved to remind everyone he had paid for. The late afternoon suns filtered through the massive bay windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the imported white marble countertops. He was tossing the keys to his silver Porsche effortlessly from one hand to the other, the metallic clinking sound echoing in the awful silence between us. He had a smirk on his face. It was the specific, arrogant smirk a man gets when he truly believes he holds all the cards in a game you do not even realize you are playing. "I built this life," he sneered, leaning against the island and crossing his arms over his tailored, charcoal gray suit. "My company built this house. My money funded this lifestyle. You just played soldier. The court will look at our actual financial contributions, and they will give you exactly what you deserve. Nothing." He laughed then. It was a cold, dismissing sound that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the room. He was a man utterly convinced of his own narrative, a man who had spent 2 decades assuming he knew exactly who I was, without ever once bothering to check if his assumptions were correct. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not pick up the heavy stack of divorce papers resting on the marble counter and throw them at his chest. I just stood perfectly still, my posture straight, my breathing slow and measured, and looked at this man, a man I had loved fiercely for 2 decades, a man I had built my youth around. And as I watched him gloat, I thought to myself, "You have no idea who you just declared war on. My name is Sarah Hayes. I am 42 years old, and I am a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. And for 20 years, I played the role of the quiet, supportive wife to Richard Vance. I want to establish that fact clearly right from the beginning. I let him believe his own hype. I let him take the center stage because, for a very long time, I loved him enough to let his ego dictate the terms of our public life. Richard came from old money, the kind of generational wealth that comes with unwritten rules and quiet judgments. His mother, Margaret, and his older sister, Victoria, practically lived at the local country club. They were women whose biggest daily struggles involved securing the right tennis court times and managing the household staff. From the day Richard introduced me to them, they never respected my military career. To them, my uniform was an embarrassment. A blue-collar job dressed up in patriotic colors. "Oh, Sarah's just going through a phase," Margaret would tell her wealthy friends over mimosa brunches, waving her diamond-ringed hand dismissively whenever someone asked about my deployments. "It gives her something to do, I suppose." But Richard carries the real financial burden of the household. Thank goodness he is so successful. I let them believe it. I never corrected Margaret when she made those snide remarks. I never defended my salary to Victoria when she mockingly asked if the military provided decent health insurance. I swallowed the insults because I thought Richard and I were a team behind closed doors. I thought the public posturing was just a tax we paid to keep his overbearing family happy. Somewhere in the middle of our 20-year marriage, without either of us ever having a formal conversation about it, we settled into rigidly defined roles. Richard handled the big financial moves. He ran his mid-sized commercial construction company with an iron fist, constantly talking about profit margins, vendor contracts, and asset management. He loved to walk into a room and act like the ultimate provider. I handle the wealth, Sarah, he used to tell me, patting my shoulder affectionately, as if I were a child who had just brought home a mediocre report card. You just focus on your little army projects. I let him believe that. Not because I was foolish, not because I was weak, and certainly not because I was oblivious. I let him believe it because I had my own accounts, my own investments, and my own deeply ingrained discipline. The Army teaches you many things, but above all, it teaches you to secure your own position. It teaches you to always have a contingency plan and to never assume the ground beneath you is stable just because it looks pretty. As Richard stood in the kitchen that afternoon, reveling in his cruelty and entirely confident in his impending legal victory, he made the greatest miscalculation of his life. He looked at my worn combat boots and assumed they meant I was poor. He looked at my silence and assumed it meant I was defeated. He assumed his construction company was the only financial engine in our marriage. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about the difference between arrogance and actual intelligence. The destruction of a 20-year marriage rarely happens in a single, explosive moment. It is usually a slow, quiet unraveling, a series of tiny betrayals that you try to ignore until they become too large to step over. The shift in Richard's behavior had started subtly about 6 months before he handed me those divorce papers. At first, it was just the phone. For 19 years, Richard had always tossed his phone carelessly onto the kitchen counter or the living room sofa. Then suddenly, it was glued to his hand. When he did set it down, it was always face down. He changed his passcode, a sequence of numbers I had known for a decade, and laughed it off as a mandatory security update from his corporate IT department. Then came the wardrobe changes. My husband, who had worn the same brand of conservative suits for 15 years, suddenly started buying fitted designer shirts and brightly colored silk ties. He started coming home late, smelling faintly of a heavy, sweet floral perfume that was definitely not mine. I am not a robot, despite my military training, despite the emotional armor I wear for a living. I am a woman who loved her husband. When I found the undeniable proof, it nearly broke me in half. It was a Tuesday morning. Richard had left early for what he claimed was an emergency site inspection. I was taking his dry cleaning to the car when a piece of heavy, cream-colored paper slipped out of the inside pocket of his jacket. I picked it up. It was a receipt from a high-end boutique downtown. The total was $20,000. The item listed was a custom-set diamond pendant necklace. My birthday had passed 3 months ago. Our anniversary was not until the fall, and my neck was painfully bare. I walked upstairs to our master bathroom, locked the door, and sank to the cold tile floor. I sat there with my back pressed against the bathtub, clutching that crumpled receipt in my hand, and I wept. I cried for the 20 years of my youth that I had poured into a man who was now spending thousands of dollars to decorate someone else. I cried for the children we never had, for the lonely nights I spent waiting for him to come home, and for the humiliating realization that Margaret and Victoria were probably laughing behind my back. The pain was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could barely draw a breath. But the Army taught me something crucial. You are allowed to bleed. You are allowed to hurt. But you are never, ever allowed to surrender. After an hour on that bathroom floor, the tears simply stopped. A cold, sharp clarity washed over me, pushing the grief aside and replacing it with pure, unadulterated focus. I stood up, washed my face in the sink, and looked at my reflection in the mirror. The grieving wife was gone. The lieutenant colonel was clocking in. I did not confront him when he came home that night. When he kissed my cheek and fed me a lie about traffic on the interstate, I smiled and offered him a plate of dinner. I did not scream. I did not ask about the necklace. Instead, I went to work. In the military, when a situation deteriorates, you do not panic. You gather intelligence. The next day, while Richard was at the office, I accessed the cloud backup for the dashcam installed in his luxury SUV. It took me 3 hours of listening to mundane traffic noise before I finally hit the gold mine. It was a recording from the previous Friday. I heard Richard's voice, low and intimate. Then I heard her. Her name was Chloe. She had a high-pitched, breathless voice that sounded painfully young, 24, maybe 25 at most. I sat at my dining room table, a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and listened to my husband promise this girl the world. I heard them discussing a recent trip to Aspen, a trip he had told me was a crucial networking retreat for his business. But the dashcam audio was only the beginning. The real shock came when I started digging into the financial records he had carelessly left logged in on our home office computer. Richard thought I was completely ignorant about money, so he had grown sloppy. I spent 4 nights quietly pulling credit card statements, bank ledgers, and business expense reports. What I found was a sickening, deliberate trap. Richard was not just having an affair. He was financially sabotaging our life. He was siphoning money from our joint savings account in small, untraceable increments, moving it into an offshore LLC. He was using his construction company's operational funds to pay for Chloe's luxury apartment rent and their lavish vacations. Worse, he was actively racking up massive debts under the company's name, intentionally driving it toward bankruptcy. His plan became crystal clear as I stared at the spreadsheets illuminating my laptop screen in the dark. He was going to file for divorce, claim the business was failing, and split the massive, fabricated debt with me. He was going to walk away with his hidden cash to start a new life with Chloe, while leaving me financially ruined, drowning in his liabilities. He thought I was just a naive soldier who blindly trusted her wealthy husband. He thought I would be entirely blindsided when he finally dropped the axe. I closed the laptop gently, a strange, dangerous smile spreading across my face in the dark, empty house. I did not need to cry anymore. I needed a lawyer. The offices of Price and Associates were located on the top floor of a sleek downtown high-rise, overlooking the very city Richard believed he owned. Evelyn Price was a legend in local legal circles. She was a woman known for her tailored suits, her razor-sharp intellect, and her absolute ruthlessness when it came to dismantling arrogant men in divorce court. When I walked into her meticulously organized office on a rainy Thursday morning, carrying a heavy leather briefcase packed with 2 decades of financial history, I finally felt a glimmer of hope returning to my chest. I sat down in the plush leather chair across from her massive oak desk and pulled out a thick, meticulously tabbed binder. I did not just feel like a victim anymore, stepping into that office. Laying out my strategy, I felt human again. He thinks he is the breadwinner, I told Evelyn, my voice steady and cold as I pushed the heavy binder across the polished wood surface of her desk. He is preparing to file for divorce, and he plans to saddle me with massive, fabricated corporate debt while he runs off with his 24-year-old mistress. Evelyn opened the binder, her sharp eyes scanning the first few pages of the financial summaries I had spent nights compiling. At first, she simply nodded, her expression neutral as she reviewed the credit card statements and the dashcam transcripts, detailing Richard's infidelity and his careless spending on Chloe. But as she turned to the second section of the binder, the section detailing my personal financial portfolio, Evelyn's professional composure cracked. Her eyes widened, scanning the rows of numbers. Jumping from one verified bank statement to another, she looked up at me, pushed her reading glasses down the bridge of her nose, and took a deep breath. "Sarah," Evelyn whispered, her voice laced with genuine shock. "You telling me he does not know about any of this?" "No," I smiled. A genuine, Quiet smile that reached my eyes for the first time in weeks. He never bothered to ask. For 20 years. While Richard was busy loudly proclaiming himself the king of our financial empire, I had been quietly, methodically building a fortress of my own. I had maxed out my military thrift savings plan every single year. I had taken every cent of my hazard pay from multiple overseas deployments and invested it strictly into high-yield index funds. But the crown jewel of my financial independence was something far more substantial. 10 years ago, my beloved grandfather had passed away, leaving me a massive, multi-million-dollar estate. Instead of flaunting it, I quietly placed the inheritance into private investments and a secure holding company. Richard knew my grandfather had died, but because he viewed my family as strictly middle class, he never even asked if there was a will. He was so blinded by his own superiority that he missed the fact that his wife was silently sitting on a net worth that dwarfed his own. A few weeks after that meeting with Evelyn, before the court date was officially set, Richard insisted we attend the annual family Thanksgiving dinner at his mother's sprawling estate. It was a torturous evening, dripping with passive-aggressive hostility and the clinking of expensive crystal. Margaret, Richard's mother, sat at the head of the long dining table, draped in pearls, looking at me with a sickening display of fake pity. "It is such a shame about the state of your marriage." Sarah Margaret sighed loudly, ensuring the entire table fell silent to listen to her. "Richard has worked so incredibly hard for his wealth. He has built an absolute empire from the ground up. I just hope you are not going to be greedy in the divorce proceedings. After all, military pay is barely enough to buy groceries. And we all know you have grown accustomed to a certain lifestyle." Richard leaned back in his mahogany chair, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. He smirked, wrapping a patronizing arm around his sister, Victoria, who was already nodding in agreement with their mother. "Do not worry about it, Mother," Richard said smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. "My lawyer is making sure she only gets exactly what she contributed to this marriage, which, let us be honest, is next to nothing." I looked at all of them sitting there in their designer clothes, so incredibly secure in their shared delusion. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs, a chaotic drumbeat of anger and anticipation. But my voice remained as smooth and steady as glass. I dabbed my mouth with a linen napkin, placed it delicately on the table, and met Richard's mocking gaze perfectly. "I completely agree." "Richard," I said softly, offering him a chilling, knowing smile. "Everyone should get exactly what they earned." The courtroom was freezing, a cavernous space filled with dark wood paneling and the oppressive hum of fluorescent lights. I sat beside Evelyn at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit. Across the aisle, Richard sat with his high-priced attorney, Gregory Holston. Richard looked remarkably relaxed, adjusting his expensive silk tie and glancing back at his mother and sister in the gallery, flashing them a confident, arrogant wink. He truly believed this was merely a formality, a brief legal hurdle before he could run off to his new luxury apartment with Chloe. Gregory Holston delivered his opening statement with theatrical flair. He painted me exactly as I knew he would, as a financial freeloader. He described Richard as the sole driving force of our household, the brilliant entrepreneur who carried the heavy burden of providing for a wife who coasted through life on a meager government salary. When he finished, Richard looked exceptionally pleased with himself. Then it was Evelyn's turn. She did not just stand up to present my secret wealth. She stood up to drop an absolute bomb that would completely obliterate Richard's entire reality. Evelyn walked to the center of the courtroom, holding a single, verified folder. "Your Honor," she began, her voice ringing out with crystal-clear authority. "Mr. Vance's counsel claims that my client contributed nothing, and that Mr. Vance built his company entirely alone. However, financial records from the IRS and the State Business Bureau show that Mr. Vance's construction company actually went completely bankrupt exactly 10 years ago. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the courtroom. Richard's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. His face turned the color of chalk. In the gallery, Margaret let out a loud, audible gasp. Clutching her pearl necklace, Evelyn did not pause. The company was saved from total liquidation by a massive bailout from an anonymous angel investor through a private LLC. That LLC, Evelyn paused, turning slowly to look directly into Richard's terrified eyes, is entirely owned and operated by my client, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hayes. She legally owns 60% of his company, the very company he has been using as a personal piggy bank to fund his extramarital affairs. Richard jumped violently out of his chair clattering against the wooden floor. "That is a lie," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. The polished veneer completely shattered. "That is impossible." Judge Alvarez slammed her wooden gavel down so hard it echoed like a gunshot. "Sit down immediately, Mr. Vance. The documents are verified and legally binding. The revelation was absolute. Not only was my personal net worth in the multi-millions, carefully shielded from his reckless spending, and not only was my military pension fully protected by federal law, but I was the legal majority owner of the very company he used to buy diamond necklaces for his mistress." The judge's ruling was swift and devastating. I kept every single cent of my private assets. I was granted full controlling power of the construction company, and Richard was legally ordered to pay back every single dollar he had fraudulently spent on Chloe from the corporate accounts. He walked into that courtroom believing he was a king. He walked out a broken, penniless man drowning in debt. I did not retreat into the shadows after the divorce. I stepped fully and brightly into the light. Within a month, I sold Richard's shares of the company, liquidating the remaining assets to open a philanthropic foundation. I created a sanctuary and career training center designed specifically to provide housing, resources, and respect for female military veterans transitioning back to civilian life. I found a sisterhood. I found purpose. And eventually, I met a wonderful, grounded man who did not care about my bank accounts, but cared deeply about my soul, a man who asked about my day and actually listened to the answer. As for Richard, his tragic downfall was absolute. Chloe left him the exact second his corporate credit cards were declined at a luxury boutique. He was forced to move into a tiny, rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city, working a miserable mid-level management job just to scrape by and pay off his mounting legal debts. He learned the hardest lesson of all. When you try to build your success on the broken back of a loyal partner, you will eventually collapse under the weight of your own arrogance. I walked away with my dignity, my wealth, and my freedom, proving once and for all that a woman's quiet strength should never, ever be mistaken for weakness. The days immediately following the court's final ruling felt entirely surreal, as if I had suddenly stepped out of a suffocating, windowless room and into a vast, sunlit field. For 20 years, I had navigated the treacherous, invisible landmines of Richard's fragile ego, constantly shrinking my own accomplishments so that his could appear larger. Now, the heavy, suffocating weight of his arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a profound and brilliant silence in the massive custom-built house he had once claimed as his exclusive domain. I walked through the empty hallways, running my fingers over the imported marble countertops and the expensive mahogany trim, feeling absolutely nothing but a sense of absolute liberation. He was gone, legally and physically removed from my sanctuary. I did not waste my time wallowing in the ashes of a dead marriage. Instead, I immediately instructed Evelyn Price to begin the aggressive, methodical liquidation of my newly acquired 60% controlling stake in his former construction company. We dismantled his corporate empire piece by piece, selling off the heavy machinery, the lucrative vendor contracts, and the commercial real estate holdings to the highest bidders in the state. Every single dollar that poured in from the liquidation was placed securely into a protected, high-yield trust fund under my name. I did not use this newfound, massive wealth to buy designer clothes. luxury sports cars, or meaningless status symbols to parade in front of his snobby mother and sister. I had absolutely no desire to play the shallow, superficial games of the local country club elite. Instead, I channeled every ounce of my energy resources into building something that actually mattered. I purchased a beautiful, sprawling estate on the quiet outskirts of the city, surrounded by ancient, towering oak trees and peaceful walking trails. I transformed that property into the Hayes Foundation, a comprehensive sanctuary and career transition center specifically designed for female military veterans. I poured my heart into creating a space where women who had sacrificed their youth for their country could find housing, top-tier psychological counseling, and advanced corporate job training. Walking through the brightly lit halls of the foundation, seeing the determined, hopeful faces of the women I was helping, I finally felt the deep, resonant sense of purpose that had been missing from my life for 2 decades. I found a powerful sisterhood, a community built on mutual respect and shared sacrifice, completely devoid of the toxic, patriarchal posturing I had endured during my marriage. While my life blossomed into something beautiful and deeply meaningful, Richard's reality rapidly disintegrated into a miserable, pathetic nightmare. The karmic retribution he faced was as swift as it was absolute. The very afternoon his corporate credit cards were officially frozen by the court order. Chloe, the 24-year-old mistress he had been prepared to throw my life away for, packed her designer bags and vanished without a single trace. She did not even leave a note. The moment the endless stream of luxury vacations, diamond jewelry, and expensive dinners dried up, her profound love for him completely evaporated. Stripped of his company, his wealth, and his dignity, Richard was unceremoniously kicked out of his exclusive country club. The wealthy friends he had spent years trying to impress immediately stopped returning his desperate phone calls, treating his financial ruin as if it were a highly contagious disease. Even his own family, the very people who had ruthlessly mocked my military career, quickly turned their backs on him. Margaret and Victoria were women who only respected power and money, and once Richard had neither, he became a humiliating stain on their pristine social reputation. They refused to let him move into the family estate, citing vague, hypocritical concerns about how it would look to their elite social circle. Completely isolated and drowning in the massive, court-mandated debts he owed me for the funds he had fraudulently embezzled, Richard was forced to rent a tiny, dingy, one-bedroom apartment in a rough neighborhood on the far outskirts of town. The man who once wore tailored Italian suits and tossed the keys to a silver Porsche now rode the public city bus in a worn-out jacket, commuting to a soul-crushing, minimum-wage job as a mid-level shift manager at a local hardware store. He spent his days answering to teenagers and his nights staring at the peeling paint on his ceiling, completely consumed by the agonizing realization that his own blinding arrogance had destroyed his life. He had reached for a shiny, worthless illusion and, in the process, permanently shattered a foundation made of solid gold. I never spoke to him again, completely content to let him rot in the miserable prison he had built with his own 2 hands. As I sit here today, looking out over the beautiful, sun-drenched gardens of the foundation I built, I often reflect on the true, underlying meaning of everything I endured. This story is not just a dramatic tale of financial revenge, nor is it simply about the satisfying downfall of an arrogant, cheating husband. It is fundamentally about the insidious, invisible nature of financial abuse and the vital importance of absolute self-reliance. For 20 years, I allowed a man to dictate the narrative of my own value. I allowed him to convince the world, and almost convince me, that my rigorous military service, my quiet discipline, and my steady financial contributions were somehow inferior to his loud, aggressive corporate posturing. Society spends an enormous amount of energy training women to step back, to swallow our pride, and to let our partners take the spotlight to protect their fragile masculine egos. We are taught to be the supportive foundation, while they proudly claim to be the entire house. But true partnership requires mutual, unwavering respect. When one person systematically diminishes your accomplishments, mocks your career, and attempts to control the financial narrative of your shared life, they are not protecting you, they are actively erasing you. Financial abuse does not always look like someone stealing cash directly from your purse. Often, it looks like a husband who confidently tells you that you do not need to worry your pretty little head about the investment accounts. It looks like a spouse who secretly racks up debt while smiling to your face, banking on the fact that your love will blind you to their betrayal. Richard's most fatal flaw was not just his disgusting infidelity with a woman half his age. His ultimate downfall was his blinding, toxic arrogance. He looked at a woman who had survived grueling combat deployments, who possessed the mental fortitude to lead soldiers, and he saw only a naive, submissive wife he could easily step on and discard. He mistook my chosen silence for ignorance, and he mistook my patience for weakness. I want to speak directly to every single woman listening to my voice right now. Never, under any circumstances, allow anyone to convince you that your quiet strength is a liability. Your daily sacrifices matter. Your personal dignity matters. You always deserve a permanent, respected seat at the table of your own life. You must know exactly where every single dollar of your money goes. You must secure your own financial future. And you must never apologize for fiercely protecting the assets you have worked your entire life to build. If you have ever felt undervalued, unseen, or mercilessly taken for granted by a partner who is supposed to be your greatest protector, I want you to go down to the comments right now and type the words, "I am worth it." Type it as a promise to yourself. Type it as a declaration of your own unbreakable independence. Please share this video with a sister, a mother, a daughter, or a friend who urgently needs to be reminded of her own incredible power today. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, because we are actively building a powerful, global community of strong, resilient women who absolutely refuse to be silenced or marginalized ever again. Let this story be the catalyst for your own awakening. Let it remind you that you hold the pen to your own destiny. And finally, I want to issue a very clear, uncompromising warning to anyone watching this who currently thinks they can build their own success by breaking the back of a loyal, trusting partner. Be extremely careful about the games you choose to play in the dark. The quiet, unassuming person you are so confidently underestimating today might just be the exact person who holds the legal deed to your entire future tomorrow. The truth always comes to the light, and the scales of justice always balance themselves eventually. Stay strong. Stay incredibly smart. Keep your bank accounts completely separate, and never, ever surrender your independence to anyone. Thank you for listening. And remember, you are the author of your own brilliant survival. The Hayes Foundation officially opened its massive oak doors on a crisp Tuesday morning in October. The air outside was sharp and cold, smelling heavily of pine needles and fresh autumn rain. I stood quietly in the main foyer of the beautifully restored estate, holding a warm cup of coffee. I watched the golden morning sunlight stream boldly through the massive, arched windows, illuminating the polished hardwood floors. This property was no longer just a sprawling piece of expensive real estate. It was a fortress. It was a highly secure sanctuary built specifically to protect women who had been broken by the very people who promised to love them. We had 50 fully furnished residential suites. We built a state-of-the-art computer lab for corporate retraining. We hired a dedicated, full-time team of specialized trauma counselors and financial advisors. I walked through the brightly lit hallways, listening to the gentle hum of conversation and the steady, rhythmic clicking of keyboards. For the first time in my entire adult life, my wealth was not a secret to be aggressively guarded, nor was it a weapon to be feared. It was a magnificent tool for genuine salvation. It was during our second month of operation that I met Captain Elena Rostova. Elena was a brilliant Army combat medic who had served 3 brutal tours overseas. She walked into my private office on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, her posture rigid, her eyes completely hollowed out by exhaustion. She sat down in the leather chair across from my desk and began to weep silently. Her story was a devastating, almost perfect mirror of my own past. She had returned from her final deployment to discover that her charming, wealthy husband had systematically drained every single dollar from her military savings accounts. He had forged her signature on massive bank loans. He had secretly transferred the titles of their shared vehicles into his own name. When she finally confronted him, he laughed in her face, locked her out of their pristine suburban house, and aggressively threatened to use his high-priced lawyers to take full custody of their young daughter if she dared to fight him. He told her she was completely crazy. He told her nobody would ever believe a broken, PTSD-riddled combat veteran over a respected, wealthy civilian businessman. I sat behind my desk, listening to the absolute despair in her trembling voice, and I felt a familiar, icy rage ignite deep within my chest. It was the exact same blinding arrogance I had endured from Richard. It was the exact same toxic playbook used by weak men who desperately need to crush strong women in order to feel powerful. I did not offer Elena empty, pitiful sympathies. I did not hand her a tissue and tell her that time would eventually heal her wounds. I leaned across my desk, looked directly into her terrified eyes, and made her an absolute promise. I told her that her husband had made a fatal miscalculation. I picked up my phone and immediately called Evelyn Price. Evelyn arrived at the foundation within the hour, carrying her trademark leather briefcase and wearing a ruthless, predatory smile. I sat Elena down in the main conference room, poured her a glass of water, and completely leveled the playing field. I used my foundation's massive financial endowment to place Evelyn on an unlimited legal retainer for Elena's case. We immediately filed emergency injunctions to freeze every single one of her husband's bank accounts. We hired the best forensic accountants in the state to meticulously track down every single dollar he had stolen and hidden in offshore accounts. We did exactly what the military trains you to do when faced with a hostile threat. We launched a massive, overwhelming, and highly coordinated counterattack. When Elena's husband walked into the courtroom 3 weeks later, looking smug and entirely confident, he expected to face a terrified, broke, and defenseless woman. Instead, he walked straight into an absolute legal slaughterhouse. Evelyn completely dismantled his fraudulent financial empire piece by agonizing piece. She exposed his forged signatures, his hidden accounts, and his disgusting attempts at psychological manipulation. The judge was absolutely furious, stripping him of all marital assets and granting Elena full, uncontested custody of her daughter. I sat quietly in the back row of the gallery, watching the color completely drain from his arrogant face as the final ruling was violently handed down. Elena turned around and looked at me across the crowded room, tears of profound, unbelievable relief streaming down her cheeks. In that exact moment, I finally understood the true, terrifying power of the wealth I had built. It was never about the money itself. It was about having the unlimited ammunition to fight back against a world that constantly tells women to suffer in silence. A year and a half after my divorce from Richard was finalized, I was invited to serve as the keynote speaker at the annual State Veterans Charity Gala. It was a massive, highly exclusive black tie event held in the grand ballroom of the city's most expensive luxury hotel. The massive room was heavily draped in velvet, shimmering under the brilliant light of dozens of crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of the city's most elite, wealthy citizens were in attendance, sipping expensive champagne and placing outrageous bids in the silent auction. I did not walk into that glittering ballroom alone. I walked in holding the hand of Dr. Thomas Reed. Thomas was a kind, deeply grounded civilian trauma surgeon who dedicated his weekends to volunteering at my foundation. He did not care about the size of my bank accounts. He did not feel intimidated by my military rank or my corporate influence. He was a man who possessed his own quiet, solid strength. A man who actually looked me in the eyes and listened to the absolute truth of my words. As Thomas and I walked toward our reserved table near the main stage, the crowd naturally parted for us. People whispered my name with deep, genuine respect. I was no longer the invisible, tolerated wife of a loud, arrogant businessman. I was the founder of the most successful philanthropic organization in the state, and then, completely by chance, I saw them. Margaret and Victoria were standing awkwardly near the back corner of the ballroom, hovering aggressively around the complimentary dessert table. They looked entirely out of place, without Richard's massive corporate wealth to fund their lavish lifestyles. They had rapidly tumbled down the rigid social ladder. Margaret's once pristine designer gown looked slightly dated. Victoria's forced smile looked brittle and utterly desperate as she desperately tried to catch the attention of wealthy socialites who actively ignored her. They saw me at the exact same moment I saw them. Margaret's eyes widened in profound, humiliating shock. Victoria nervously clutched her small beaded purse, taking a cautious, hesitant step backward. A year ago, the mere sight of these cruel, judgmental women would have sent a sharp spike of anxiety straight through my chest. I would have instinctively braced myself for their passive-aggressive insults and their thinly veiled mockery. But as I stood there in my stunning midnight blue evening gown, with Thomas's warm, supportive hand resting gently on the small of my back, I realized something truly beautiful. I felt absolutely nothing. I did not feel anger. I did not feel a burning desire for petty revenge. I simply felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute indifference. They were ghosts from a dead, irrelevant past. They were small, bitter women trapped inside a shallow, meaningless world of their own making. I did not turn away or pretend I had not seen them. I stopped, turned my body slightly toward their corner, and offered them a polite, completely unbothered smile. It was the kind of composed, pitying smile Margaret had forced upon me for 20 grueling years. Margaret's face instantly flushed a deep, humiliating shade of red. She quickly averted her eyes, suddenly extremely fascinated by the floor tiles. Completely unable to meet my confident gaze, I turned back to Thomas, squeezed his hand, and continued walking toward the front of the magnificent room. When I stepped up to the wooden podium to deliver my keynote speech, the massive ballroom fell into an absolute, respectful silence. I looked out over the sea of faces, past the glittering diamonds and the expensive tailored tuxedos. I spoke loudly and clearly about the devastating reality of financial abuse. I spoke about the terrifying vulnerability of female veterans and the absolute, critical necessity of providing them with the heavy armor of financial independence. I did not mention Richard's name once. I did not need to. My absolute success was the loudest, most devastating revenge imaginable. True power is not about aggressively crushing the people who actively tried to destroy you. True power is walking away from the burning wreckage of their toxic illusions, building a magnificent empire on your own unshakable terms, and never once looking back at the ashes. I finished my speech to a thunderous, roaring standing ovation, completely secure in the beautiful, undeniable truth that my life finally belonged entirely to me. 2 full years had passed since the heavy wooden gavel of Judge Alvarez permanently severed my ties to Richard Vance. In that time, the Hayes Foundation had grown from a local safe haven into a highly respected, nationally recognized organization. We had successfully opened 3 additional branches across the country, securing massive federal grants and private corporate sponsorships to expand our mission. We were pulling hundreds of female veterans out of poverty, providing them with elite corporate training, and helping them reclaim their stolen dignity. My life was a meticulously scheduled symphony of board meetings, charity galas, and quiet, peaceful weekends spent at the lake house with Thomas. I had completely moved on, leaving the toxic, suffocating memory of my 20-year marriage entirely in the rearview mirror. But arrogant, entitled men like Richard do not simply fade away into the shadows with quiet grace. When a man whose entire identity is built on dominating others finally hits rock bottom, he does not reflect on his own terrible choices. He desperately looks for someone else to drag down into the dirt with him. The final, Pathetic threat arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of a thick, certified legal envelope. I was sitting in my corner office, reviewing architectural blueprints for our new housing wing, when Evelyn Price walked in, her face set in a mask of absolute, professional disgust. Richard had somehow managed to find a sleazy, bottom-feeding attorney who was willing to work on contingency. They had filed a frivolous, completely baseless post-judgment civil lawsuit against me. The lawsuit absurdly claimed that I had deliberately committed perjury during the divorce proceedings by severely undervaluing the true, projected worth of my grandfather's inherited estate. Richard was aggressively demanding a massive, multi-million-dollar retroactive payout, claiming he was legally entitled to a portion of the foundation's initial seed money. It was a desperate, transparent extortion attempt from a broken man drowning in debt. He assumed that because I was now a highly public figure running a pristine charity, I would simply write him a massive check to make the lawsuit quietly disappear and avoid a messy public scandal. He was incredibly wrong. He had forgotten the most fundamental rule of engaging with a military veteran. We do not negotiate with terrorists. And we certainly do not pay ransoms to cowards. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. I simply looked at Evelyn, poured us both a cup of black coffee, and asked her how we were going to completely destroy him this time. Evelyn smiled. That brilliant, predatory smile that always signaled absolute devastation for her courtroom opponents. She explained that by foolishly filing this civil suit and attempting to reopen the financial discovery phase, Richard had unwittingly unlocked his own post-divorce financial records for our legal review. He had handed us the exact legal key we needed to dig into the ashes of his ruined life. I immediately authorized Evelyn to hire the most ruthless team of private forensic accountants in the state. I told them to track every single penny that had moved in or out of Richard's possession over the last 24 months. It only took them 2 weeks to find the smoking gun. The deposition took place in the sterile, windowless conference room of Evelyn's downtown law firm. Richard walked into the room wearing a cheap, ill-fitting, gray suit that looked like it had been bought off a discount rack. He looked physically terrible. His once perfectly styled hair was thinning and unkempt, his skin sallow, and his hands shook slightly as he pulled out his chair. His cheap lawyer began the proceedings with aggressive, loud demands, threatening to take the story to the local press if I did not immediately agree to a private financial settlement. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the polished glass table, offering Richard nothing but cold, absolute silence. When the lawyer finally stopped talking, Evelyn calmly opened her leather briefcase. She did not argue about the value of my inheritance. Instead, she slid a thick stack of highly classified banking documents across the table. Our forensic accountants had discovered a massive, hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands. But it was not just hidden money. The documents clearly proved that just weeks before his company went bankrupt 10 years ago, Richard had illegally embezzled over $4 million from his own commercial clients, funneling the stolen cash into this offshore shell corporation to evade the IRS and his creditors. By filing this foolish lawsuit, he had legally entered these new financial records into the public domain. Evelyn leaned forward, staring directly into Richard's terrified, bloodshot eyes. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper. "You have exactly 2 options. Option 1, you sign a permanent, binding legal waiver completely dropping this lawsuit. And you sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement forbidding you from ever mentioning my client's name again. Option 2, I walk these bank statements directly to the regional office of the FBI this afternoon, and you will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate wire fraud." Richard completely broke. There was no screaming this time, no arrogant posturing, no desperate attempts to regain control. He just stared at the undeniable evidence of his own criminal behavior, his chest heaving as the absolute reality of his destruction finally caught up to him. His hands trembled violently as he snatched the waiver from Evelyn's hand and signed his name, officially erasing himself from my life forever. 6 months after that miserable deposition, on a warm, golden afternoon in late May, I married Dr. Thomas Reed. We did not host a massive, pretentious country club wedding to impress a room full of shallow socialites. We held a small, incredibly private testimony on the wooden dock of my inherited lake house, the exact same quiet property Richard used to mockingly call my little project. I wore a simple, elegant white silk dress, and Thomas held both of my hands, looking at me with a level of profound, genuine adoration I had never experienced in my entire life. Surrounded by my closest friends, the incredible women of the foundation, and Evelyn Price, who had become a fiercely loyal sister to me, I finally stepped into the brilliant, entirely peaceful chapter of my life that I had fought so incredibly hard to secure. The shadows of the past were permanently eradicated, replaced by a beautiful, unshakable reality of my own making. As we bring this long journey to a close, I want to step away from the narrative for a moment and speak directly to you, the listener, sitting on the other side of this screen. I want to talk about the deeper, crucial truths embedded in this story, because my experience is not an isolated incident. There are millions of women currently trapped in the exact same silent, suffocating prisons of financial abuse. Society has conditioned us to believe that abuse always leaves a visible bruise, a shattered plate, or a broken door. But the most insidious, devastating form of control is entirely invisible. It is a husband who affectionately tells you not to worry your pretty head about the mortgage. It is a partner who actively mocks your career ambitions, deliberately shrinking your professional confidence so that you never outshine him. It is the slow, deliberate isolation of your financial independence until you wake up one morning and realize you are entirely dependent on a person who does not fundamentally respect your basic human rights. True equality in a relationship is impossible without financial transparency and mutual respect. When a man uses his wealth as a weapon to demand your submission, he is not a partner. He is a warden. Richard genuinely believed that because he made the loudest noise about money, he held all the absolute power. He mistook my strategic silence for weakness. He mistook my loyalty for stupidity. And that is the fatal flaw of every single arrogant abuser. They constantly underestimate the quiet, enduring strength of the women they attempt to crush. I survived, and ultimately thrived, because I refused to surrender my financial independence. I maintained my own accounts. I protected my own assets. And I utilized the brutal discipline the military taught me to secure my own future. If you are listening to my voice right now, and you feel trapped, undervalued, or manipulated by someone who uses money to control your reality, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are not trapped. You are incredibly powerful, and you possess the absolute ability to rewrite the ending of your own story. Do not confront them in a panic. Gather your evidence quietly. Secure your financial documents. Seek professional legal counsel. Build your fortress in the dark so that when the time comes to step into the light, you are completely untouchable. If you have ever been underestimated, if you have ever been told you are worth nothing, and if you are ready to reclaim your unshakable power, I want you to go down to the comments right now and type the words, "I am worth it." Let that statement be a permanent declaration of your independence. Share this video directly with a sister, a mother, or a friend who urgently needs a reminder of her own magnificent strength today. Please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, because we are building a massive, global community of resilient women who absolutely refuse to be silenced ever again. And finally, a cold, absolute warning to anyone watching this who is currently using financial manipulation to trap a loyal partner. Be incredibly careful about the games you choose to play. The quiet, unassuming woman you are so confidently tearing down today might just be the exact same woman who holds the verified legal documents that will completely destroy your entire future tomorrow. The truth always comes to the light, and karma never misses its intended target. Stay strong, Protect your assets. Demand absolute respect. And never, ever let anyone else write the final chapter of your beautiful life. Let us take a quiet moment to reflect on the true heart of Sarah's journey. This is not just a satisfying story about courtroom revenge. It is a profound, vital lesson about the invisible dynamics of power, respect, and financial independence within a marriage. For decades, society has heavily conditioned women to shrink themselves. We are taught to step back. We are taught to quiet our ambitions. We are told to let our partners take the spotlight to protect their fragile egos. But true partnership is never built on one person erasing the other. Richard's absolute downfall was not just his disgusting infidelity. It was his blinding, toxic arrogance. He looked at a dedicated, highly disciplined woman and saw only someone he could control. He used his wealth as a weapon. He mistakenly believed that whoever makes the most noise holds the most power. But true power is completely silent. True power is disciplined. The greatest takeaway from this story is that your personal independence is your absolute best armor. You must always know exactly where you stand. You must protect your assets. You must understand your financial reality. And you must never, under any circumstances, allow anyone to convince you that your daily contributions are worthless. If you are watching this right now, and you feel trapped by someone who uses money to manipulate you, please remember Sarah's strategy. Do not panic. Gather your evidence in silence. Build your impenetrable fortress in the dark. You have the absolute, undeniable right to a respected seat at the table of your own life. Never mistake a woman's chosen silence for ignorance. And never, ever surrender your dignity to someone who refuses to see your incredible worth. This content is meticulously researched, constructed, and manually edited by our team to bring you profound meaning and valuable lessons.